We've been reporting how the replacement to Justice Kennedy could have a big impact on your life, on Americans' lives around the country. What about on the president's life? Does Donald Trump, for example, have the requirement to turn over evidence? Does he have to testify before a grand jury? And here's a big question for this or any president. Under our system, can a president be indicted? Clearly, those are all questions that only the Supreme Court decides in our system, and we've seen that in past decisions involving Presidents Nixon and Clinton.
The Supreme Court has just ruled on the tapes controversy, and here's Carl Stern, who has that ruling. It is a unanimous decision, Doug, ordering the President of the United States to turn over the tapes.
The unanimous ruling now clears the way for Paula Jones to pursue her sexual harassment lawsuit against President Clinton. The court's opinion, written by Justice John Paul Stevens, says the case involves unofficial conduct by an individual who just happens to be president.
I'm joined by Richard Painter, a former White House ethics chief in a Republican administration under George W. Bush. He's now running for Senate as a Democrat in Minnesota. We haven't gotten to the Russia probe much in this hour, given all the other issues. But do you view, as a legal matter, given your experience, the fact that the president is under this open criminal probe and the statements and things that he has done or allegedly done regarding that probe, should that enter in to his authority and the treatment of his nominee to fill this post?
Yes, it should. These United States House and Senate Judiciary Committees should have months ago started hearings to investigate the president's violations of the Constitution, obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and other crimes, just as they did in 1973 with respect to President Nixon. We are well past the point we were with President Nixon when the House and Senate Judiciary Committees had those hearings. They have not done that. That is the top priority. And when they're finished with those hearings and they report to the full House and the Senate, with respect to President Trump and Vice President Pence, we will then know whether these two men will remain in office.
All right,
I think
and
there's
Richard,
a very good chance that they could both be out.
Richard,
I don't see how.
Let me ask it this way. There are also reports in the Washington Post, as you recall, that even after picking Gorsuch, Donald Trump, according to his own White House leaks, basically then worried Gorsuch would not be, quote, loyal, because he was critical of Donald Trump's attacks on the judiciary. Do you have a concern that this president might view this pick in a self-interested manner regarding the open probe and not thinking about this as an independent jurist?
Well, I don't just have a concern about that. I know that that's the way he's going to pick a justice, because that's the way he has talked ever since he ran for president and throughout his presidency. He does not want to participate within a democratic system set forth in the Constitution. And once again, it is the obligation of the House and Senate Judiciary Committees to be looking into his fitness for office and that of the vice president before they consider for a lifetime appointment on the United States Supreme Court someone nominated by Donald Trump. And yes, he is going to choose somebody to simply further his own agenda, to make sure that his unconstitutional payments from foreign governments are permitted, even though they violate the Emoluments Clause, and to allow him otherwise to, to obstruct the Constitution.
Right.
And I am amazed that they would consider a nominee from this president before they have those hearings that they have an obligation to have, just as they did in 1973 with respect to President Nixon.
I have to fit in a break, but the audience, I think, can see in the way you're running your campaign and what you're advocating the Senate should do a difference to some of the current incumbents. And last night we saw a change of the guard there. And this is the party debate within the Democratic establishment right now. You're putting your positions out there clearly, and I think it's what we're going to see in these midterms, because you raised some profound questions tonight. As always, thank you, Richard Painter, for joining us. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.